All right. Well, according to my clock, it is the top of the hour. So, welcome, John Cutler. Pleasure to have you.
Yeah, great to be here, Josh.
John, if you don't know John, you're probably missing out because he's prolific on the social webs and, he's very well known for wonderful, incredibly valuable posts all over the place, especially on LinkedIn and other places. And his Beautiful Mess newsletter is an absolute gem. So if you don't follow that or subscribe, I would suggest you do. You'll learn a heck of a lot. John, I think of you as like a merciless, continuous learner, someone who's just voracious at learning and improving. So
I'm obsessed with writing. No, it's funny. People reach out and they say, well, what can they learn from creating content? And I remind them that it's not necessary to write as much as I do to get into this. But yeah, I love the writing and exploring and bringing people along for the journey. So
that's great.
Yeah, that's that.
Very cool. Welcome, Dimitri Kerievsky. Dimitri's name is almost spelled like my brother's name. He only has one I at the end. So I've never seen the spelling with two I's. Interesting. All right. Well, why don't we jump into this? We've been talking about various mantras from the book I wrote called Joy of Agility. And where it's open to talk about several mantras, but the mantra for today is called Start Minimal and Evolve. And this one actually took some time to actually put the right words to it. At one point it was like start simple and evolve. And I kind of like struggled with the name and got a lot of good feedback on learning from friends and colleagues. But that's what it came to, start minimal and evolve. What does that mean to you, John?
It's the thing that comes to mind is the sensation when you're doing it. So there is that you're facing some problem or some puzzle or some challenge, and usually there's every bone in your body is telling you to take a big slice of this thing, to plan it out. And there's an instinct you have in the back of your ear that says, I think if we just attack it this way, something that feels a lot more minimal, something more lightweight, I'm going to learn a lot. But the thing that comes to mind is that it's a lot easier to say than do.
Oh, yes.
We've all been in these situations where you feel the pull of trying to plan big, and do all this stuff. And then you have to take a small little slice of it. So I think of it more as an instinct that you have to build and that you have to build confidence about. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think of it as the feeling you get when you're faced with some gnarly problem and the little voice in your head is saying, try this little slice. And the big voice is saying, do all the things, and you listen to the little voice.
Yes. I think it's for me, a lot of it comes down to risk management. It's basically, hey, if I do something really small to start with, I could get feedback. I could learn from it. I could manage some risk. I could just, not do too much where I'm gone too far down the road and it's just going to be a waste. So I want to read really quickly from the book itself. I'll just read the beginning paragraph of Start Minimal and Evolve. When you don't know exactly what to create, what will delight customers, or what will help you achieve your goals, it helps to start with something minimal and iteratively improve it. Instead of guessing as to what to create, acknowledge that you are operating under conditions of uncertainty and use an approach that helps you quickly and easily learn what to create. This helps you drive out fear, another mantra in the book. Start minimal and evolve is also clearly related to the mantra, be poised to adapt, since it requires rapidly adapting as you learn what to evolve. So this mantra is very connected to other mantras, including be quick but don't hurry. We'll talk about how that is connected. It's really a deep and important mantra, and it's not an easy one to master. None of them are. So yeah, what are challenges? Why is this hard for people? Why is it difficult?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is you have to have seen it work out. I remember earlier in my career, I hadn't seen certain things work out. The only thing I knew was I go back and look at these huge Gantt charts and these huge things that I used to put together. I should share them too. We all learn about these things. And I remember looking at those, and that was all I knew. And so I think that for a lot of people, it's actually about building the confidence that that approach will work. And I think we often talk about mindset with this. And to me, it's often a little distracting. Like what I think about is someone's experiences and lived experiences and what they've seen work. And so I think, so that's challenge number one. Have you seen any of this work?
Right.
And, an example would be, a team is about to jump into something and you have that one voice that says, well, why don't we just get out of the building here? Why don't we go and test something with a customer? Let's sit down with them. Let's just do something side by side with the customer. And if you've seen that work, that's great. Now, if you haven't, you think, oh, that's going to be so much trouble and we're going to trouble our customer. And like, what would showing them a minimal prototype actually do for us? And don't we have better things to do? I have this plan that I've been working on to do this. And so it could be that that person just hasn't experienced that. And I've experienced enough of that working that I feel very, very confident that it's going to lead to good things. But the folks that you're working with often haven't experienced that working out.
Right. And I mean, I think so. So for me, these mantras are very much applicable to many, many activities in life and in work. So when we talk about experiencing them, it doesn't have to be that you only experience it on a software project where you evolve something from a small, thin vertical slice. I do presentations frequently to customers. And sometimes there's an internal person at the company where we're presenting who really wants to bring industrial logic in. And they have brilliant ideas and they know the political climate and they know all these things. Well, guess what? We work with them and we say, here's the skeleton, the walking skeleton of the presentation. What do you think? It's not even remotely done. It is a minimal slice. We start minimal and evolve on the presentation, the sales presentation, give it to this person, get feedback, iterate, get feedback, iterate. And we end up with a presentation that really hits the mark because we followed that approach. Again, this relates to so many things. It's not just software development. I love software development. We can get deeply into examples of this mantra in software development. But I want you to remember this mantra, all the mantras apply to many things. So
we often get paralyzed too with tackling big things. Actually, in my own work, I've been doing some workshops, and I fell for every trap that I know exists about workshops. I'm planning this big thing. And, and then, someone gives me this book, Training from the Back of the Room. And it's like, it lists these 4 C's and you should connect with people. You should then communicate a concept, then do concrete practice and then close. And I think and then of course I go back to my big plan for my workshop and I'm trying all these intricate things of that. And then a friend of mine reaches out and they said, John, just do it. Let's just do it right now.
Right.
Connect with me about what do I know? We do that in 1 minute. John, you only have 60 seconds to explain the concept. I know you want to go on for 3 hours to explain the concept. Do it in 60 seconds. I explain the concept. Now, how would we practice together? On the spot, I'm like, well, we would practice by doing this, and then we would see what's going on. Now let's close what we learned. So that point about it not just being, it is sort of an enduring principle that we need to embrace, because that, so I had spent days and days on this workshop that didn't seem to be going anywhere. And within 3 minutes with this person, I was already going through the training from the back of the room cycle in 5-minute increments and learning more in that 1 hour than I did in, dozens and dozens of hours doing something else. So yeah, definitely not software, just software.
So, yeah. And that's a great, perfect story. I mean, and so drive out fear is one of these other mantras in the book. We're going to talk about that next week with Linda Rising. But drive out fear to me is very closely related to this because, we have the fear that we're not going to put on a good workshop, or we're not going to give a good proposal, or we're not going to build the right software or build the right product. And so how do we drive out the fear of that? Well, one way is to learn faster, right? And the sooner you teach your first workshop, the sooner you're going to learn, hey, what works, what doesn't work. How do I adjust this? You might find a lot of things are working perfectly. Just need a couple of tweaks here and there. So, driving out fear, this is a technique in a way for driving out fear.
Yeah. I feel that that's also a part of it where you do need to suspend the fear and suspend the disbelief for these short periods of time to be able to do that. There's a great story from a place where I worked called Appfolio here in Santa Barbara, and if I'm understanding correctly, they went for a couple quarters debating this machine learning thing. Is it going to make money? What technology are we going to use? They met every week. They discussed it. And I think there was a point where someone kind of hit the wall and they said, you know what? We have people upstairs who can review the applications in under 60 seconds. I'll put a progress meter on the screen while they do it. And then we'll test this out. Well, let's make money tomorrow. The thing that jumps out back to what you were talking about is, imagine after that level of investment and everyone's is deeply vested in this effort and they're vested in the technology. Imagine that you're a lead architect or whatever, and you've been spending all your time researching machine learning, and there's a lot of expectations. The founder is in the room of the company wondering what's going on. Talk about fear, so the creating an environment where someone could even propose that is half the work, and I think that's that reminded me of what you just said, that you have to create these environments where you can't have the fear of doing that.
Right. So the culture must allow for this to occur. It's extremely important. There's so you used a phrase when we were talking before the show started about learning faster than you ship and shipping faster than you learn. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was funny. I worked at a company that was involved in the data space called Amplitude for a long time. And my coworker, Tanner McGrath, had this great line, are you shipping faster than you learn or learning faster than you ship? And one of the interesting things about that statement is there are parts of the technology ecosystem or product making ecosystem where the problem is they're actually shipping too fast. They're shipping faster than they can learn.
Right.
And so if you think about like my little training from the back of the room example, imagine if I did that in 5 minutes, but I never really incorporated what I learned in those 5 minutes. I just kept blindly going away and trying to do that. The important point though is that many companies are actually kind of learning faster than they ship. Every bit of feedback that's coming to the sales team, every bit of feedback that's coming to the group, the company's brimming with ideas, which in a sense are encapsulated learning. It's brimming with ideas, and they can't get through that cycle fast enough to do that. And I think that was an important realization for me, to people to think about where their companies are at, because in some companies, the constraint is the ability it is really all a learning loop in a sense, but their constraint is actually closing the loop on the learning by getting something out there. Whereas in other companies, it might be the reverse to do that. So it was a curious way to think about it. That it's not just always shipping faster. It could actually be about figuring out how to learn. So that stood out to me as an interesting problem.
So for the companies that are sort of they're learning faster than they ship, do they need to get the balance better between those two?
I think so. I mean, if you think about it in terms of constraint, if you think about learning as some insight that will be converted into value, and if you were to plot that out, on a Kanban board from like insight kind of thing all the way to the right to closing the loop on that insight, this is what causes massive frustration in those companies. Like I said, people are brimming with ideas. Now, we could debate and say those are hippo ideas, but I don't think that's being quite empathetic to the situation there. You're sitting there, you're an executive, you've got a business to run, you have ideas, everyone has ideas, and the apparatus of closing the loop on that learning is not working as you would expect. And so I think that, if we drew Kanban boards as a loop, which I've tried, which is a lot of fun, instead of just doing it as a left to right board, it's gunked up in one spot. And you need to close that. You need to close that part of the loop to be able to be successful. And I think that for a lot of teams, they focus too much. I'm I'm a little cautious. It's very popular in the product space now to talk about product discovery and product research and all these things. These are all very valuable tools, but I worry that it just becomes another version of sort of big design up front without really validating those assumptions and bringing them through the loop. So what those companies are doing is, because of the fear they might have with shipping, the fear they have getting thing out there into the world, they're displacing that fear onto being particularly obsessive about discovery and learning and things. But on the other side, the flip side is true, which is where you see a lot of anxiety in the industry about incrementalism and, we ship crap and we never go back to fix it. So both of these, this is a polarity, and both things can be true depending on where you sit on that.
Very hard to get the balance right. I mean, so I know people sometimes feel like unprofessional to put something unfinished out there,
Yeah.
or that's not as fancy as the competitor potentially. Although it actually might be an asset. It might be something. Hey, we like this bare bones feature. We don't know. We have to learn. But if there's this professionalism, which is kind of misplaced professionalism, it's sort of like must be shiny. It must be brand aware. It's got to have all the bells and whistles. Otherwise, it's going to hurt our brand, right? That just stops you cold with Start Minimal and Evolve. You simply can't do it, or you're just afraid of a higher speed learning loop.
I think also the thing too is there is a skill to, and I learned this when I was heavily involved in music and music production. There is a skill to architecting your recording session in a way that lets you improve. And there are ways that bring you down to a bad place. So what that means is that this is where experience matters. This is where some companies, they try sort of some MVP in it, and they just end up with some crappy MVP out there because they weren't thinking about architecting for extensibility. They weren't, and this isn't about being obsessed with will it scale. It's actually about the decisions that you push off, in many ways to do it. So there is a skill involved with the actions that you take to allow that kind of extensibility and experimentation that I think gets missed often in the conversation.
I'm thinking of a startup we've helped recently, which, they had spent a lot of money for a year. They got a piece of junky software from some outsourced developers, very low skilled. We came in, looked at the code. We're like, this is just horrible. They couldn't even demo the software. It would fall on its face as they did demos to try to raise money. It was a disaster. And the suggestion was, let's rewrite it from scratch. So we spent 2 months really, producing something that could make them money. And we had to make some decisions there, which eventually we had to undo months later, like using some certain AWS authentication feature, which was fine for the short term, but for the long term, not good at all. And when you had to undo that, you can take months to undo that authentication work, So going into it, it's like, well, what is the big picture here? How could we be smarter about our early ideas when we start minimal? How do you start minimal smartly? And you don't want to be paralyzed by fear that you're making the wrong choices, but you want to make smarter choices. So today we're helping a new startup, and we're probably just jumping straight to using a non-Amazon based authentication service because we know it's going to be more fully featured in down the line and better place to start.
Yeah, this kind of goes along with, I think, this idea of like thinking big, working small, which is. I was joking with Jason Yip about this. So here, if you follow through with this, there are companies that only think big that can't work small. They'll never get anything done, right? There are companies that only think small, work small, and can't think big.
Right.
And they will just go and iterate themselves into circles. Or if they're data driven, they'll drive in data circles. They'll just they'll squander that. And then there's companies that think big and can work small. And by think big, I don't mean like the executive going in like, we need to have a grand vision. It's about being able to sort of rehearsing or mapping out the space, kind of diverging on what you're doing and at least mapping out some potential futures for what might happen. And then saying, let's put that all to the side for now. The danger is people do those exercises and then they think, now we've got to build it all.
Right.
But you should do those exercises to imagine how the space might evolve, put that to the side as a little bug in your ear, about where things might go, and then continue to work small to do that stuff. I would argue that you can teach teams to think big easier than you can teach teams to work small. So start your, if you have to be biased to one, start with the work small. At least then they'll get that part, which what we're talking about today. And we can teach them how to think big, but the reverse is not as easy.
Yeah, love that. It's making me think a little bit of the book, The Magic of the Subtle Magic of what is the book about? Cleaning up your house, right? I don't have the name handy. I write about it in my book in the resourceful section. But her point is, you could make a little change in every room. Let me clean something up in every little room, and still get nowhere. Your house is still a mess.
Yeah.
You have to also think big. Okay, I'm going to take this entire room, and this room is going to become super clean. And now I'm going to do it, in small chunks. But I'm just taking one room from the house, not the whole house, and I'm going big on it. And I'm going to do it with little acts of cleaning. Think big, start small. I mean, it's hard. If someone wants to write a book, well, don't start writing the book. Write a blog. Write a couple paragraphs. See how that does.
It's I mean, the reason why I say that working small too, I think is the harder thing is that's where the rubber hits the road. I mean, that is the working part of it, right? So and I think that's it. I was coaching a product manager that legitimately had some 18-month, 24-month mega thing to deal with. And they had options, they could kind of put people off to the side and try to do it while no one noticed. That was one option. Or they could try to do it more incrementally and see, but it was a wicked problem. It was legitimately a wicked problem. We brought in some outside help to look at it, and they were like, this is a wicked problem. I've been doing this for a long time. This is a wicked problem to do it. And I think the important point there is it's almost like the start minimal still can relate to those things. It's almost like a bias. Like when met with a couple decisions about what to do, it's that person saying, can we just get this field to go from there to over there across these 3 systems in a week? Like just that one thing. And so I think that what's important for folks is, even when you meet these wicked efforts, you can still apply this heuristic. It's going to be a little uncomfortable, but you can still make progress. I'm just acknowledging that sometimes we are faced with these like wicked efforts, and that doesn't mean that you can't still apply this principle. I'm sure you have experience with that too, with like big refactors and stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a story in my book that a friend told me in Norway, and they were basically, they wanted to change the way people bought train tickets in Norway. The only way they could buy train tickets in Norway, this is years ago, was through these machines that were, controlled by the train system. They were embedded software. You could not update them without going to each and every machine and basically upgrading the embedded software on it. It was old days. They were like, we got to get this on the web. Okay, big picture, we want train tickets that are purchasable through the web, and you could go to a store, a convenience store, or a train station and buy them with a modern system. They wanted a modern system. Well, where did they start? Well, they had some really smart, very agile-minded people, and they said, let's start. They had some drinks one night. The product manager and the tech lead went ahead and had the drinks. Said, let's start with one convenience shop where we just put a little system in with one button, buy a ticket. And that one button would just let you buy a ticket from that station that you're at to the next big city. That's it. One way. That's it. One ticket, one button. Nothing fancy. And it had to like prove that it could, talk to the payment gateway and do all the other work. And they did it. They built it in a matter of days, put it into the convenience store, and they found people actually used it. They pressed the button and they got their ticket. And they debugged a little bit. There's one little issue. Then they went on to the second convenience store, and then the third. And before you know it, the whole thing was rolled out across the country. Start minimal and evolve. Yeah. And it's a real story. This is not pretend. This has actually happened, right? I mean, so you got a big goal in mind. Start really small.
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting too, in the Valley, at least, there have been a couple of well-known companies. I think Figma is one of them, that were known for spending, so the myth is they spent years to launch this big perfect thing. I guess his name is Dylan something. He was at a conference recently. He's like, everyone fetishizes that side of what we did. I wish we hadn't done that, right? But the other thing which was interesting is often those companies have design partners for those 3 years that they're basically building for, 10, 20, 30, 40 companies. And I've been involved directly in companies like that and or advising companies like that. And so I think that this skews the logic people have. They look at some of these big releases or very polished products that are celebrated for being that polished and get a lot of critical acclaim for being that polished. Yet at the same time, you're not seeing behind the scenes. Like, you're not seeing them working with those design partners over potentially quarters or years to be able to do that. And so I think sometimes working minimal can be choosing who your design partners are. It's who is that small set of customers that allow you to be able to do that. And I think it's very easy to get distracted by the stories that we hear and not look behind the scenes to what happens. And I think that's I'm just addressing directly a trend recently in the last year or two where you've seen people write that, like, the idea of lean startup is dead, or this and this is dead, or doing this thing is dead. And then they point to these companies that had these very visible, polished releases, and it's not really digging into what's going on behind the scenes. And so it's something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Google Docs came out, and I was just like, it could do far less than Word, but it did do something Word didn't do at the time, which was
Yeah.
let multiple people collaborate on the same document at the same time. So it had provided this unbelievable feature that just didn't exist before, but it wasn't super polished. It wasn't like full featured. It just did something amazing that had a really important point in the marketplace. There's a lot.
I do think that one of the things that people need to keep in mind is it does help to really clarify what you think the risk is. And where this goes to is that, for example, let's say you're displacing some on-prem software that's been used for a long time. And it's in a very well-known vertical where people have been operating their businesses this way. And you can literally look at the on-prem solutions and see how they've evolved over 2 decades. Honestly, you don't need to go out and test every single little feature on that, unless your competitive differentiator is going to be to upend the market and have them do this way. So I'll mention this company I worked at, Appfolio, here in Santa Barbara. They were displacing property management software. Now, property management software has a way that you do accounting, which is not going to change. It's a well-known business that has a flow. It has, you're not going to reinvent property management, although they ended up reinventing parts of it eventually. So the risk wasn't necessarily about knowing the space or knowing the job to be done. There were other risks, though, involved. It could be your go-to-market risk, or it could be your risk with, are we going to architect this the same way? And so I think that that's one of the critical skills, is it's minimal for what? And so I think that a lot of teams kind of blindly try to be minimal because they've heard, I'll hear, this happens a lot. I don't know why, maybe some agilists say this all the time, but they're like, you're never going to know until you get it out there in production. Well, I was a UX researcher and I've done a fair amount of work in this. And there are some things that we can learn a lot more cheaply than shipping software.
That's right. That's right.
And so I think that but the risk, but that might not be the risk, right? So I think that a good tool to start with for any team is to think about, do a pre-mortem activity. It's a year from now and this has all gone to crap. Like, what did happen? Was it because we didn't architect this correctly, or is it because we missed the mark on customers, or is it we couldn't get up into the enterprise like we thought we could? So I think that that's a good first step to thinking about where to target your minimal approach.
Like a big UX up front, for example. I mean, we see that all the time where they engage these firms to do your UX work. They're not actually testing it on people. They're really just glorified, graphic designers who are designing something pretty. And then you go and program it and it's a disaster, from a UX point of view.
Well, and a great example for that is they might be trying to disrupt some industry, and that industry doesn't want to be disrupted or something, right?
That's the Appfolio story. That is the Appfolio story, because Appfolio's founders first went to garage shops thinking they'd improve the software used in garage shops. And they found out that these garage owners had no interest in upgrading their software whatsoever.
Yeah.
No interest. So they
Well,
pivoted to, building
yeah.
management and all that.
Well, and that's the thing too, is that if you're, there are some spaces that unless you can go end to end on the workflow for some person trying to do their work, you will not sell your product. You will not get them to use the product because they can't go from A to Z. But maybe the bet of your company is that there's a lot of cruft and leftover process involved with administrating the product. And your bet is that, like, what, the world has gotten a little flatter. People aren't worried about these fine-grained permissions or controls. It might be that, people aren't as worried about running reports in the old way. That's your bet as a company. That's your sort of strategic bet. That's the think big.
Yes.
So when you think about minimalism, no, it's not going to help you to do only 1/3 of the workflow, because customers will want to get from A to Z. However, it might benefit you to remove all reporting functionality, just make it an email, and remove all fine-grained permissioning. Not going to need it, because that's your bet. And so I think that's the thinking minimal isn't always just, it's doing the tiniest thing possible for the risks that are part of your strategy. And that's an important thing to consider.
It makes me think of Chris Rock in a tiny comedy club near his home, where people have signed an NDA, and he's got a yellow legal pad filled with potential new jokes. And his think big is, I'm going to do a Netflix show where they're going to pay me millions of dollars. His think small is, I'm going to test a bunch of new, really early new jokes on people and see how they react. He's taking bets on every little joke, very minimal and very risk managed, right? He's managing the risk. He's trying to see, did this generate any kind of laugh, smile, a twinkle in someone's eye? It's exactly what we're talking about applied to a comedy show.
Yeah. One interesting thing is, when I mean risk too, sometimes the biggest risk is that there's an unexplored upside. So we tend to think, and when you do pre-mortem activities, there's a tendency to go through and just, the shit's exploded, this and this, you come up with all these ideas. And then the person in the back of the room will say, no, the biggest risk here is we twiddle our thumbs and miss this sea current change that exists. It's not whether we, so in some cases, the risk is actually the upside risk that you're not getting as well.
That relates to, I think, the number of experiments you're doing, right? Because if you're not experimenting rapidly, a modern agile principle, experiment and learn rapidly, right? You're not really probably going to find that thing that's the differentiator.
You mentioned the learning part. I think part of this too is, if you really want to know if you're working minimally, is to add the right column on the Kanban board that says learn. Like, can you talk about, I think that this is there's so much talk about experimentation. There's so much talk about testing, and everyone aspirationally wants to do all this, and they all talk about it. And then you ask them, like, did anyone discuss? Did you actually sit down and discuss whether you did learn anything? And they're saying, oh, no, we were too busy to be able to do that. That's back to are you shipping faster than you learn? So to do it minimally, you also need to include closing the loop, which is, I think, where a lot of teams get mixed up.
You got to slow down to learn, right? To reflect and learn and decide, are we going to change? Are we going to pivot based on what we learned? Are we doing anything different there? Or is it just a factory of, your feature factory concept, or just the continuous busyness, as Tim Ottinger likes to call it, right? How busy are we? Yeah. Interesting. Well, we should take a few questions from the audience. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Thanks for attending. Let's see here. A couple of things I want to mention. So Alexander has mentioned here, starting with a minimal approach and gradually evolving is a great and only working strategy. By focusing on the essential aspects and iterating as needed, we can avoid unnecessary complexity and adapt more effectively. So, I think there are people, though, that would say this is not true. We can define a bunch of things up front, and this evolutionary design leads to too much rework. There are plenty of people that say that. Too much rework. You're wasting time reworking. You could have done a little bit more planning up front, and this is all nonsense. That's why Agile's going down.
I love the book. There's How Big Things Get Done. It's a great book about mega projects. I would suggest everyone reads it. And first of all, it's like the chance that a mega project is going to work out is very low, but some mega projects work out better than others. For example, solar arrays and solar plants have a much greater chance of success than nuclear power plants, for example. And he lists a bunch of principles, modularization being one of them. There's certain types of guidance and things that you can do. It was an eye-opening book because we sort of, he has a point in the sense we here we are building something that's going to make a company $1 million, and there's a company doing couple $1 billion mega project. And we think we can't plan for our $1 million thing. And it's like, well, actually, I don't know. But what I loved about his principles, he has one in there about thinking slow and acting very fast.
Mm.
And was this idea that when we think about planning, we think about coming up with all these assumptions and making the big Gantt chart and doing that. And what he calls planning is actually like an active thinking process. It's rehearsal. And he references, I think someone you've referenced he calls it Pixar planning, which is when they're working on a Pixar movie, they're meeting each week, they're sort of showing a revision of the movie, and they're going through this process of being able to rehearse, in a sense, what they're doing. The opposite of it is, he says, the mega projects, that because time is such a factor, you need to finish the mega project very quickly. Otherwise, there'll be an earthquake, or there'll be a tsunami, or something's going to happen to be able to do it. What I love, though, is he applies it to software and accepts that in software, what we're often doing is rehearsal. It's like a continuous rehearsal with what we're doing to be able to get that. And so I like that a lot, because I think that people, we're thinking about our software projects, and then someone will say, well, could we just plan a little bit more here? I think what they're saying is, could we do some participatory rehearsal here more?
Right.
And so I think that they might have a point if that's what they mean, but that's often not what they mean. Right. And so I think that that's the, I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think that's what's going on with that. Like, I think some people do have a point that we could do an event storming activity, that we could try to rehearse this effort. We could think, why not spend a couple days sort of exploring the universe of potential outcomes here to inform our approach, to rehearse, to go through the motions.
Yes.
It seems like an inexpensive thing to do, but also it's starting minimally. It's like doing what you can. So I don't know. I don't think that's the type of planning most people do, though. Unfortunately, they're not doing Pixar planning.
Yeah. I mean, well, the book Creativity Inc. I mean, it's still an absolute classic. So if you want to know more about Pixar and how they operate, and then when they make those movies, they don't start out with perfect animations. They start out with very crude versions of just experimenting with the scene, just to see.
They're reducing risk. They're getting the right eyes on it to be able to do those things. They're getting diverse perspectives. They're getting people who've made a bunch of movies to look at the rough sketches.
That's right.
Every week.
That's right. So the term I use all the time is, evolutionary design. And to me, it applies to all those things in life, and movie making, as well as software or anything else. It's evolutionary design. There's the real skill to it. It takes effort and skill to learn, how do I start with something minimal? Like, how minimal do you mean? Right? If I'm playing blackjack, could I play blackjack without an ace card? Because an ace card's complicated. It's an 11 and it's a 1 in different situations. Could I make a version of blackjack early on that doesn't have an ace and still play the game, the essence of the game of hitting and staying? Well, probably it could, but they don't think that way. I got to have 52 cards. I found it takes time.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned in the evolutionary design thing is, as someone who's played in the UX space and product space, and at least I know engineers, but which I don't know. There is so much more in common from a philosophical standpoint with UX and engineering than people make it out to believe. I'll frequently hear someone say, oh, the big design up front. And what they're referring to is 20 years ago, when some agency was brought in and had 35 screens that they needed to develop. That's not the state of practice at the moment. That's not. So concepts around evolutionary design, concepts about exploring these potential futures that might exist, concepts of, there's way more in common with something like event storming and journey mapping or blueprinting from a service standpoint now than it was. And so I would encourage people to give that a second try if you've been burned in the past on that, because I think there's a lot more in common. And I know this to be true. I did an event storming exercise recently, and it was just an amazing activity to have you design folks, the customer, customer people involved, product managers, customer support people involved. And then engineers were involved in watching the domains emerge somewhat organically from the exercise so that they could take a slice across that thing. That's a really incredible collaboration opportunity that if all you remember is a designer showing up with 50 screens and build this, that's not what's happening now among teams. So you should consider it.
I'd say that, like, from my experience working with web design companies, they still do wireframes, and they'll say, hey, we're going to redo your entire website. We're going to create 50 wireframes for the entire website. It'll take us 3 or 4 months, and then we'll give them to you. And then, we can implement it for you, or you can. And I'm like, hell no, no way. We'll make a little change to the website every day or every couple days, and it's going to evolve. Great. Let's look at the big picture where we want the design to go. But we're going to do this incrementally, and we're going to learn all along the way. We're not waiting 3 or 4 months to redesign the website and then take months to do that. I still see elements of that in parts of the industry, at least.
Yeah. And it is, that actually, the marketing website thing is a great example. Now there's products like Sanity, which is a headless content management system, which is very developer forward. If you go to their site, it's literally like on the main site, it's, npm install, like get going on this. And one thing that you see now is like the state of the art of a marketing website is a combination of a design system, a headless CMS, and then giving the team the ability to iterate and adapt. It's not like WordPress feels very antiquated compared to this approach of doing it. And so like, there's always I think there's the beauty in this is that modern approaches do emerge over time, and opportunities to collaborate emerge over time. And that's just a very simple example of something that's it accepts the developer's role in all this, and it accepts the content designer's role in all this. And it accepts the need to iterate and adapt it accepts that you might reskin your marketing site tomorrow and build it out. So that's just a fun, just real world example of what you see out there at the moment.
I love that. I mean, in ways that I often come back to other mantras in the book, and one is be balanced and graceful. And what you just said, keeping the needs of the content people, the content marketers, the developers, the branding people, it's a balancing act to get the right kind of solution in place for everyone to be happy.
Which is one of the hardest part about the start minimal often involves working with people. I'm reminded of the Amy Edmondson professional culture clash thing. It's going to be hard almost by the definition of starting minimal. You might be taking this slice. And when you take a slice, you're going to be running into people that you don't work with often, who you're going to have to communicate this particular thing. And that's where I at least see workshops and other things as, I just mentioned that event storming exercise. People walked out, the marketer walked out of that saying, well, that was amazing. Normally we just make up this customer journey map. And we did this activity with developers. They were building sort of professional connections between people. They were understanding that we're way more similar than we are different, even though we do have our differences in a workplace. And so I think that one thing that you see is the tech teams working minimally, but not building bridges to the rest of the organization about what that means or inviting them into the process. And so working minimally does involve inviting people in almost by definition to what you're doing, which is something that you'll need to juggle.
Yeah, the secret sauce we have for that is something I learned from a guy named Three many years ago, and I can even hold up my. I still have this. This is Three. This is a little mock-up of Three's. He had a VW van that he drove for probably 600,000 miles. But he taught me chartering, and chartering is that wonderful. It's probably a lot like your North Star framework. We don't have time to get into that, but chartering is where you figure out, who are we working with? What are those events, those main key events? That's the context diagramming. What are we going after here? What would success look like? What are the risks to manage? All of those wonderful things. And that's something we have to slow down to do at the early parts of the project and keep updating as we go. Without that, I think you lose sight of the big picture. And, to start
Yeah. I mean,
minimally
anyone who's
well,
walked into some boring kickoff where someone just lays out a 75-page deck,
oh God, yeah, yeah,
I mean, that's like soul crushing.
that's death.
Uh, it's very different than the chartering thing that you're describing. And
Yes.
I used to have this mantra of sort of start together, work together, finish together. But I think that kind of relates to this too. The thing you notice different companies, some companies, there's a lot of working together, but there's not a lot of starting together and there's not a lot of finishing together.
Yes.
The teams are all working, but they don't close efforts together and they don't start together. And then there's some groups that start together, but then it just no one works together after that and they don't finish together. They do the nice kickoff and then nothing ever happens.
Yes.
And the closure is the important thing. I mean, how many teams do the cross-functional work and work together, but don't make time for that celebration? And I think why this relates to the start minimal thing is you can just scale down all of these things and still keep it in mind as you're working minimally. Like, how can it's as much about how you're working as the slice that you pick up. What is the minimal version of starting together with this? What's the minimal version of working together? What's the minimal version of closing this experiment together? And so it's how you work, not just the slices that you take out of the product or what you're doing.
Love it. Love it. Absolutely. We could easily talk for another 45 minutes or hour, but we've hit time here.
Oh yeah,
John,
45 minutes. There we go.
thank you so much. Thanks so much for joining us and sharing all your brilliance and wonderful things to keep learning from John. If you want to learn more about him, where's the best place to go?
Right now, I've decamped to LinkedIn, and then the newsletter probably is the best way. It's on Substack at the moment. Yeah, it's called The Beautiful Mess.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you again for being here. We'll be back next week to talk about Drive Out Fear with Linda Rising, who's
that's going to be amazing. Yeah,
amazing.
wonderful.
She's a co-author of a couple of books on related to that topic, the fearless change and more fearless change. So really looking forward to that conversation. But John, this has just been incredible. Thank you so much for taking some time with us.
My pleasure. All right, talk to everyone soon. Bye.
Yeah.